Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipsson. Welcome to episode 134 of Sports Management Podcast. Did you know that 65% of you who listen to this podcast do not yet subscribe? That means that you are at risk of missing out new episodes, and with the lineup that I have for 2024, that is not something you want to miss. So hit that subscribe button on your podcast app, and together we will grow Sports Management Podcast. Thank you. Now, today's guest is Jordan Gardner. He's the former CEO and chairman of the board for the Danish soccer team FC Helsingør, and a consultant to the 21st Group. Jordan is considered one of the best football executives in the world, and in this episode we spoke about why multi-club ownership is the future of football, choosing to invest in FC Helsingør, being a minority owner of Swansea City Football Club, how much say a minority owner has, his opinion about the Saudi Pro League, leveraging data in football clubs, why European clubs are attractive to American investors, and much more. Jordan Gardner, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's my great pleasure. So you are a former CEO and chairman of the board for FC Helsingør. You're also a consultant for the 21st Group and also a lecturer at Stockholm School of Economics, among other things. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about what you're up to?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm currently a consultant with a company called 21st Group out of London, which is a football-focused data consultancy. Have been involved in a variety of roles at football clubs across Europe. I've been an investor. I'm an investor in Swansea City Football Club, which is in Wales and is in the Championship. I also was a board member of Dundalk Football Club in the Republic of Ireland. And as you mentioned, I was chairman and CEO for 4 years of FC Helsingør in Denmark, and we were in the Danish First Division. So I work a lot with Americans specifically looking to both invest and operate football clubs in Europe, trying to help them do it better, more efficiently, figure out ways to run these clubs better. And yeah, kind of bridging that gap between North American business mindset and the intricacies of sport in Europe.
Yeah, so as an American, you have invested in European clubs. So what do you see the potential in Europe? Why have you chosen to invest in European clubs?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's pretty significant structural differences between sport in North America and Europe, obviously. But from an investment and a financial perspective, there's a general consensus that European sport is undervalued. I think, you have a system of promotion relegation, you have a robust player trading market, and you have valuations on clubs that are quite significantly less than North America. And so I think there's opportunity there. My background is I both played football or soccer in the United States, but I have an entrepreneurial background. And I think the idea that you can go buy a smaller club and get it promoted. We got our club promoted in Denmark. You can add value. You can run these clubs and businesses better than they currently are and hopefully make them profitable ventures, whether that's, make them cash flow positive, which can be difficult, or, obviously find financial returns when you exit. And so I think the structures in place, while different, offer opportunities in Europe that maybe don't exist in North America.
And I know, for example, in Sweden, many clubs have what we call a 51% rule, meaning that the members need to have a majority ownership of the club. So can that make it a little bit more difficult to invest in some of the European clubs?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Look, I think the best example of that is Germany, where you're seeing minimal amounts of outside or private investment into German football. You do have a handful of clubs that have minority investors from abroad, but generally the 50+1 rule does scare away investors for obvious reasons. I think the arbitrage opportunity or the opportunities in European sport are at the operational level. And if you can't control a majority stake in a football club in this case, it can become difficult to rationalize making investments. And so I think that's probably what keeps away a lot of outside investment in those leagues that have 50+1. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think that's probably a separate discussion. I do think Many clubs that are majority owned by community organizations are run quite well. A lot of the German clubs, a lot of the Swedish clubs, clubs in Austria that have those rules are run quite well. And then you have the opposite end of the spectrum where there isn't a level of sophistication where many of those clubs can compete with maybe privately owned clubs. But again, on the flip side, privately owned clubs, there's good owners and bad owners. So, it's a little bit of hit and miss. I personally think there's lots of opportunity in markets like Sweden and in Swedish football that if the rules were ever to change, there would be a lot of interest. But obviously, that's a philosophical issue for the ecosystem in that country to decide if that's something they want.
Of course. You have also said that multi-club ownership is the future. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right now, from a financial perspective, it can be quite difficult to make a single football club a profitable venture. There just isn't enough revenue streams. There's not enough players you can sell and develop. I think the idea that under an umbrella organization, let's just talk, for example, City Football Group, you can own multiple clubs, have pathways for players to move, to sell players, to diversify your revenue stream. So if one of your clubs get relegated, it doesn't, massively hurt your portfolio financially. So I think, it's not just multi-club. Multi-club's one piece of a larger growing ecosystem in football where, there's investment in academies, there's investment in new geographic areas, whether that's South America, whether that's Africa, whether that's Asia. I think multi-club creates an environment where you can hopefully, if done effectively, monetize that and run clubs more efficiently. Obviously, from an execution standpoint, it can be quite difficult. We're seeing lots of examples of multi-club groups having a lot of difficulty, figuring out how to make that work both on the pitch and off the pitch from a financial perspective. But I do believe there's an increasing trend both to kind of scoop up from investment groups and more sophisticated groups to kind of scoop up the available clubs and assets that are most attractive and put them under a holding company umbrella that maybe mirrors what they would see in more of a private equity or a more financial background where they can diversify and look at long-term financial returns.
Interesting. So you mentioned before you're an investor in Swansea and you used to be the CEO of Helsingør. So when investing in a football club, what are some pillars that you're looking for before investing?
Yeah, I mean, look, it depends on the investment thesis of each group and what their philosophy is. For me, I've made my investments in European football to learn and understand and try to get access behind the scenes at different football clubs and try to maybe avoid some of the mistakes that other, in my case, American owners have made. I think for the most part, what people look at when they're looking to invest in the sport, they're looking at the financial health of the clubs they're looking at. Obviously, many European football clubs are not run well and are loss-making businesses, so that can be challenging. A lot of times people are looking at infrastructure, whether that's stadium infrastructure, whether that's academy infrastructure. I think certainly from an American perspective, you're looking at particularly real estate, not just stadium, but is there adjacent real estate? Many clubs own, whether it's hotels attached to their stadiums or training facilities or whatnot. So I think those are things that are interesting. I think, as I mentioned, academies and youth infrastructure, I think is quite important. Building up youth infrastructure from scratch can be both time consuming and expensive. So I think from a big picture perspective, those are some of the areas people are looking at. Obviously, geographic location is a pretty big one, whether you're looking at this from a business perspective or not. People want to own clubs in attractive locations and, clubs in central London. One of the reasons Chelsea was so attractive is because it's in West London, right? Versus, you look at the Manchester United sale, which was also attractive for many reasons, but it's not London. And so I think geographic location is probably something that most people don't realize is quite important.
I spoke recently to Mario Malavey, who's co-founder and co-CEO of Mercury 13. He talked a lot about when they invest also the commercial opportunities that a club can bring. Is that something that you value as well highly?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely opportunities. Many clubs are under commercialized. They don't build out because many European football clubs are not treated quote unquote like businesses. There is a lack of investment in both infrastructure in terms of people and a lack of interest in maximizing commercial opportunities. But I would push back a little bit in terms of these are relatively simple and small businesses in the scheme of things. And there are only so many sponsorship opportunities. There are only so much tickets you can sell in hospitality. Now, if you look at a club, let's just say Tottenham, who's opening a brand new North American style stadium, I think from a commercial perspective, they have massive opportunities, whether it's bringing in NFL games from, teams from the United States to commercialize that, whether that's their 5, 6, 7 levels of hospitality. I get that. But from just a day-to-day on a simple level from a football club, I think it can be difficult to show actual growth from a new ownership perspective or an investment perspective where the new revenue is coming from a commercial perspective, especially when there are a lot of sensitivities around for instance, maximizing ticket prices, right? I think we could probably spend a whole podcast talking about that when it comes to European sport. So I think it's very easy for outside investors to come in and say, yeah, like we can double, triple, quadruple commercial revenue because we're smart guys. And I don't think that's insignificant, but I also think that is not necessarily the solution to the difficulty some of these clubs have. I personally feel that the issue is that these clubs don't control for costs, and that's much more of an issue than the idea of increasing revenue from the commercial side.
Yeah, interesting. And I read another quote that you have said then that the club spent too much money on wages and that they don't have the financial discipline in other areas. So that talks to a little bit what you just mentioned there.
Yeah, I mean, I firmly believe that. No, obviously you don't have North American style salary caps and wage controls that you would, and, at the end of the day, I think as more revenue comes into the sport, whether that's new media rights deals, whether that's new commercial revenue, unfortunately, most clubs just spend that on players and player wages. And that's obviously by far and away your biggest revenue or expense line item at a football club. And I think, whether it's a vanity play or a lack of discipline or whatever the reasons are, clubs just, or honestly, some clubs just aren't trying to make the day-to-day financials work, whether they're owned by a sovereign wealth fund or an ultra high net worth individual that isn't interested in making a sustainable business. But I think for this sport to have long-term sustainability, we need to be talking about controlling for costs. And I think there just isn't a lot of interest in that, unfortunately. But most of the investment groups that I work with and talk to, and most of the projects I've been involved with, that's all we talk about, is we talk about how do we both have success on the pitch and figure out financial models that sustainably work. And that is a difficult balance.
Definitely. How important is it to leverage data to make smart decisions and to make these good investments that you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think data is really important. I think it's kind of a buzzword that everyone who gets into football says we're going to use data. So I think when it comes to actual practice and execution, it can be challenging. I think the clubs and investment groups that do it best have their own proprietary in-house IP that no one's talking about, whether it's the folks, Brentford, Brighton, who have their own access to outside IP when it comes to gambling companies, whether it's the Redbird Capitals who own their own data consultancies within the umbrella of their own investment portfolios. Obviously every club in some form is using data, whether it's open source, whether it's Y-Scout or whatnot. I find from a philosophical standpoint, it's really important to combine the use of data with scouting, with still real world analysis. I think having that human element is really important. And so I think data is important. I think data isn't just, I think a lot of people think it as, it's a tool to recruit players and we can go use data to find the next player in the Brazilian third division to help our club. To me, data is much more broad than that. It is player performance, it's health and wellness, it's injury prevention. It's even getting down to a granular level when it comes to players, helping them with their nutrition and sleep and all that kind of stuff. And so I think it's really important. The most sophisticated clubs are doing that and doing it in a very sophisticated way in-house. But most investment groups that I've seen just say, hey, we want to use data and we're going to use data better than anyone else. And I don't actually understand how they do it any different than anyone else.
I see. So you obviously have experience from soccer. You said you played yourself and you have also been CEO in San Francisco Football Club. So getting the experience from US soccer and moving to Europe, and I'm thinking now specifically for FC Helsingør, what was some things that you changed when you came in with kind of a new perspective?
Yeah. So we had to make a lot of changes when we bought FC Helsingør. It was transitioning from a club that was a nonprofit or association or what they call forening in Denmark to a AS, which is a for-profit company in Denmark. And so really the club was not professionalized really in any sense of the word. And they had kind of had a rapid rise through the divisions all the way up to the Danish Super League and then kind of gotten relegated and were on their way back down. So for us, it was really instilling a sense of financial discipline. It was bringing in a lot of new people who understood that we wanted to run this club in a professional manner. It was implementing data. It was hiring new staff. I think the biggest and most successful thing we did is we brought in a fantastic coach, sporting director, COO. So we had a really good management team. And I think that was really important. We also really had a really cohesive strategy when it came to recruitment. We focused mostly just straight on the best Scandinavian players we can find. We weren't interested in bringing in players from Africa or other places. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of the structural changes we made in the organization were really helpful. And we brought in people that built good culture at our club. And so to answer your question, I think we pretty much changed everything. And that was partly out of necessity, just with the structural differences with the way the club was. But also, we tried to come in and take a different approach. And I think that led to a lot of our success based on a lot of our competitors in Denmark at that time.
Is there a lot of pushback when you come in as a quote unquote outsider, then making, a lot of changes? Do you feel, was there some pushback from some members of the club?
Yeah, we definitely had pushback. A lot of these clubs, there's a lot of people in and around the clubs, whether that's supporters, sponsors, your own staff, that are resistant to change, just because these are institutions that have been around for a long time and they're slow moving objects. And we did get a lot of pushback. The only thing that made it, I guess, a little bit easier for us is the club had really been struggling and had gone through a relegation. So that I think gave us a little bit of an acceptance that people understood that change was going to have to happen at the club for the club to move forward. So I think absolutely we did receive a lot of pushback, a lot of kind of our American way of thinking. We did get pushback. And for us, it was also certainly over time adjusting to, we had an American way of thinking and a way we thought we should run the club. Certainly the local Danes had a way that they thought the club should be run. And then for us over time, and for me personally as the CEO, it was figuring out a way that we can bridge the gap between an American way of thinking and also being respectful to the way businesses and football clubs are run in Denmark. And that took some time to adjust. I think we got there eventually, but it definitely was challenging at the beginning.
I'm sure. And as you said, like if you have been running a club and someone comes in and says that everything is wrong, basically, and changing it, maybe you're taking that personally and getting over that hill. I understand it's a little bit of a bump, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was it with FC Helsingør again? Like why? Because it's not FC Copenhagen. It's not a very big team. It's maybe like if you're outside of Denmark, you probably don't know about it.
Yeah.
So how did you get your eye on this club and then later choose to invest in it?
Yeah. So in 2019, after I had been involved on a couple different football related projects, I decided to put a group together, an investment group, and we were going to buy a majority stake in a club and, actually try to execute that model. And I think the thought process behind myself and a lot of the investors I worked with was, we all knew people, Americans who had invested in Premier League clubs, La Liga clubs, and really had a lot of difficulty, maybe lost a lot of money, had left, were really unhappy. And for us, we looked at it like any other business in that we need to come in and show proof of concept that we can operate and execute a smaller club in a quote unquote smaller country before we jump into the Premier League. So ultimately I picked Denmark because it felt like it was the right place for a variety of reasons. Most people speak English in Denmark, which was definitely something that was important to us going into Italy, Spain, France. The language, the culture, was obviously vastly different than the United States. So the language is important. Infrastructure was really good at most of the clubs we looked at, good stadiums, good training facilities. Danish football was just kind of starting to become on the global scale, was really kind of catching people's attention. The national team was starting to do well. A couple of the clubs, including Copenhagen, had done well in the Champions League. And the entry points for clubs were quite low. And so the idea was, okay, Denmark seems like the right fit for me. Now, what kind of club? FC Copenhagen obviously is way too big. The ticket size is too big. The scale is too big. Let's kind of go down one step and decide, okay, what are the clubs that maybe have been in the Superliga or are in the Superliga? We wanted a club that was close to Copenhagen for a variety of reasons, including accessibility for our ownership group, for recruitment from players. And then, so, obviously there's a limited pool of clubs in that fit that area. And so you have Lyngby, you have, HBK, and then obviously FC Helsingør came up as a club that had just been in the Superliga, had a new stadium opening. So it kind of checked the box from an infrastructure perspective. And so obviously the transition from the club going from a Forening to an AS was helpful for us in terms of when we bought the club, we were not buying it from a private individual. We were buying it from an organization that no one was taking the money. So we negotiated terms where all the money we invested went into the club, and that was attractive for us. So I think from a variety of angles, it made a lot of sense for us, and I still think it was the right decision. So yeah, obviously it's kind of random. You're right. No, most people haven't heard of it until we were involved in the project. But I think ultimately at the end of the day, it was the right club for the right size for us, and it made sense for us.
Interesting. So we mentioned before that this with the 51% rule, that might be some things that might be a hurdle to investing in a European club. On the flip side, for an American investor, European football might be attractive as it has an accessible price. What other, if you would weigh like the upside and the downside with investing in European clubs, what are some difficulties and what are some opportunities?
Yeah, I think the biggest opportunity, as you mentioned, is the ticket, the price. I think 15, 20 years ago in North America, if you were a wealthy family or a wealthy individual and you wanted to invest in sport, which obviously is quite attractive, and you had, 15, 20 million US lying around, you decide want to invest, you could probably invest in minor league baseball, maybe at that time, depending how early it was, Major League Soccer, maybe a minority investment in the NBA or the NHL. Now that ticket size there's almost nothing. You can't get into women's soccer. You definitely can't get into MLS. Minor league baseball, you can't get into anymore. But for that ticket size, you can get a pretty decent sized club in Europe. You're not going to be in the Premier League, but so the barriers to entry are quite low. I think there's attractiveness because many of these clubs are in attractive countries where people will visit on vacation and, hey, I want to tell my friends if I'm a wealthy individual, I own a club in the south of France. I think there's that vanity component to it. I think from a challenging perspective, obviously you have a structure in place that Americans are not familiar with. You have a relegation system where if you don't perform on the pitch, your asset will drop significantly in value. Your revenues will drop significantly in value. You don't have a system where it's centrally controlled, where costs are controlled, or salary caps, or revenue sharing. You don't have any of these things in place. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the cultural differences, language, laws, not just culturally in society in these countries, but a footballing culture that can be very different from place to place to place. And so I think a lot of the work that I do is kind of holding the hand of a lot of North Americans through this process to make sure they understand what they're getting themselves into when they go into these places, and understanding that, if you successfully owned an NFL team, going to the Premier League, while it may seem similar, is not in many cases. And a lot of your revenue streams are very variable. You have a lot of non-recurring revenue streams, whether that's, dependent on performance on the pitch, whether that's selling a player. You have a lot of things that are out of your control. And I think, Americans, when it comes to investment in general, or investment in sport, they like certainty. And I think European sport cannot give that to them. And there's a lot higher risk involved in investing in the sport. So I think it's a lot talking about risk tolerance. So certainly there's pros and cons. I think the frustration that I have is a lot of Americans jump into European sport and with no basis of understanding of what they're getting themselves into. But I think over the last couple of years, there is more sophistication. There's more knowledge and understanding of the differences and intricacies and the opportunities and also the challenges.
Do you feel like many Americans don't do their due diligence before they jump into European clubs?
I think many do financial diligence and they know what to look at with the numbers, but I don't know if they do diligence when it comes to really truly understanding the risks involved with investing in European sport. I think there's very little diligence when it comes to human capital in terms of, okay, I've just bought a La Liga club. Who's going to operate that club for me? I'm coming in with an American mindset. I have a certain way I want to run that club. Presumably the people who previously owned the club, most clubs that are for sale are distressed in some form, I would say is a pretty general, safe thing to say. And so I think there's a lack of understanding of who's actually going to execute these models, execute these businesses, run them more efficiently, try to keep costs down, because that is the goal of many American investment groups. So I don't think it's a lack of someone buying a football club without doing financial or legal diligence. I think it's more of just operational diligence is lacking at times.
Now we have a Saudi Pro League, and there are several players moving there, obviously for their salaries, and that puts a fear in some European clubs, maybe Americans too, that they cannot keep the players. And we talked about before with financial discipline, not spend too much on wages. So how do you think that the Saudi Pro League is affecting European and American soccer?
I don't think it's affecting American soccer right now. Obviously they were competing, with the Saudis to get Messi, and Messi decided to sign. I think from a quality of life perspective, it's pretty safe to say that if Messi's choosing between living in Miami and Saudi, he's probably going to choose Miami, even if it is less money. I don't think at this time it's probably a factor yet for European clubs. The league is not built out enough yet from a larger infrastructure perspective. They don't have enough clubs that are structurally sound, I think, in a way that they can compete with European clubs. That doesn't mean it won't happen in the coming years. I do think they are building something that is quite interesting. So I think right now, you're right, it is difficult in terms of if you're negotiating with a player and he's getting 3 times the wages in Saudi, that is a difficult negotiation, but it takes a level of discipline to say, okay, look, if you want to go to Saudi for the money, go to Saudi for the money. That's fine. I think in the future, when things move forward, as more and more players do eventually go there, and the reputation and the infrastructure of the league grows, it will become more of a challenge. But I don't see it competing anytime soon with the top leagues in Europe. I think it's definitely, while they're not going for players that are over a certain age, I do still think the league is in its infancy, and it's not challenging in any way, shape, or form yet with the European leagues, and that's just something we'll have to see over time.
I'm interested about your background also. How did you get into soccer in the first place, and a little bit your life journey up until where we are now?
Yeah. So my dad had played soccer, not professionally, but he had pushed me to play soccer at a young age, and I played semi-professionally in the U.S. And I had to drop that ultimately because I started a company, a a technology company that I ran in university. And ultimately, when I sold my company 9 or 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to get back into soccer and the business side. And I think that's what interests me. I was involved, as you mentioned, in a couple of smaller projects in the US. And then I really saw this opportunity as an entrepreneur to go and be involved in projects in Europe. And so I'm fortunate in the case that I've been able to allocate strategic capital to be involved in projects on the investment and board level. Obviously, now I've transitioned more on the operational consulting day-to-day level, which is good and something I'm obviously interested in. So, it's definitely been a unique journey for me, but I think I come definitely with this kind of unique perspective coming from, outside the sport, having played the sport, but not at a professional level, from the business world, from North America, looking at Europe, like having a lot of these different perspectives where I think at times, sometimes I see a lot of insular thinking when it comes to this sport. And so I think it helps to kind of have a fresh worldview when it comes to looking at these football clubs.
And now then with the 21st group, then you can merge the data and the soccer aspects that you have had in your life previously.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I work with them. I think they're a fantastic company. And, I think the clubs that, they work with have a leg up when it comes to, implementing data on a day-to-day basis, whether that's building out their own IP in terms of data infrastructure, whether that's looking in terms of how do we budget for an upcoming season, whether we're looking at buying a football club and how do we diligence, the football playing side. I think there's all sorts of interesting pieces that they work with. So I think that's where it's a really nice combination where I come with like the day-to-day real world operational background and, they have a strong data background and we can combine that. And that's where there's a lot of interest in. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Looking through your career now, we went through it a little bit faster, but has there been any bumps on the road in your career? And if so, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, probably the first 6 to 12 months of our project in Denmark, in Helsingør, was very, very challenging. I think the club, this transition from the club going from a community organization to a for-profit business was very challenging for the club and for us as an investment group. I think culturally, it was, it's one thing to be a board member or a minority investor in a football club, and it's a totally different situation to be the chairman and the CEO of a club and be responsible for the day-to-day. And I think there were a lot of cultural differences that I didn't necessarily anticipate when we went to Denmark. I think, you go to Denmark, you go to Copenhagen, you go for a week on holiday. It's great. It seems very similar to the US, but obviously living there, doing business there, culturally, it's very, very difficult. So I think there were some difficult times for us, and for me personally, and I think we kind of had to get over that hump. Then that kind of ran right into COVID, which obviously was a separate challenge that everyone had to deal with. But I think I couldn't necessarily imagine going through those challenges at a bigger club, at bigger scale, with a much larger fan base or much larger dollar amounts being at risk. I'm glad we did it at a relatively small club, but I think that was a challenge for me where there definitely were days where I was like, look, I'm not sure I want to do this. Is this worth it? This is such a forward-facing business, and the amount of criticism and the amount of difficulties were definitely difficult to deal with. And I think that was probably the first time in this footballing space I was in that I really had to face those and overcome those, and that was difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure. So you mentioned that you have been an owner, but also a minority owner at Swansea. So most of us are not owners in clubs, so maybe we don't know exactly how it works. But when you're a minority investor, a minority owner, how much say do you have in that club?
You have no say. Unless you obviously have some sort of management agreement or negotiated agreement with the majority owners, you have no say. So for me, being a minority minority owner means I can go to the games and sit in the box and talk to the CEO or the manager if I want to. It gives you access behind the scenes a little bit, but from an operational decision making, none whatsoever.
Because that's what I've heard too, that and also the minority shares are usually on a little bit of a discount because of that you don't actually have any like voting rights and you don't have anything to actually say about different questions.
That's correct. And this is going back to the 50+1 situation, why a lot of people don't want to make investments from a minority position, because if you don't have actual say to install CEO, create your budget, make decisions, then what exactly are you doing there? Now, for me, I've been doing it for very specific reasons. But if you're investing, if you're going to invest 50 million euros into a German club and only get 25%, what exactly is that get you? Maybe get you a board seat. Maybe obviously that has to be negotiated. But in terms of actual decision making, presumably it gets you none, which can be problematic.
So why then do a minority investment? Is it because you're a fan of that club, or it's like an inexpensive VIP ticket? It sounds like.
That's part of it. I think the thinking from a lot of investors, this wasn't my thinking, but a lot of investors think, I'll make a minority investment. I'll get my foot in the door at a football club. And over time, maybe through my relationships with the majority shareholders, I'll increase my equity to a point where I'll eventually become a majority shareholder. So if you look at what the San Francisco 49ers guys have done at Leeds United, they came in at, I don't remember the number, but 15 or 20% in year one. Then they increased to, I think, 25 or 30%. They increased to like 10 to 15% over a period of years. And they gradually understood how the club was working, what they thought they would eventually need to change. And I think by year 3 or year 4, they eventually bought a controlling interest of the club. So the thinking is, can we slowly, gradually turn that into a minority stake in a club? That's what a lot of people think. Other people, you're right, they're just fans of the team and they want to support the club. Maybe they think it's a good, sound, long-term investment where it's just a passive investment. For me, it was access and learning and understanding. There's a lot of different reasons why people do it.
You invested in Swansea in 2018 and you're still a minority owner. So what is your reason for investing?
Yeah, so at that time, I had no involvement in European football. I felt like it was, first off, the club was in the Premier League at the time, and through multiple connections with one of my business partners, I was given the opportunity to invest a small amount. And, from a personal perspective, look, getting the ability to be a small shareholder in a Premier League club is amazing. And I thought that would be amazing. But it also gave me the ability to get access and see kind of a little bit behind the scenes of what a Premier League club, how it was being run. And I think that was probably my main motivation. I went over and was in the owner's box probably 7 or 8 times that season. Unfortunately, the club got relegated, but it was a really, really good learning experience for me as kind of someone who didn't have a lot of experience in European sport, to kind of see behind the scenes how the club was being run. It gives you a level of access that you just don't have as like a fan or just showing up to a team.
Yeah, I can see that. If you have the interest to invest in a team, being my majority owner is a good start to get this insight and the behind the scenes that you can get from the minority investment.
Yeah, I mean, that's my thought process. Obviously, everyone has a different way of looking at things, but it's also, you're thinking, what is the investment risk tolerance? We're talking, what's the ticket size? So that comes into play as well.
You are a guest lecturer at Stockholm School of Economics. I've also done some cooperation with them. So a lot of students listening, a lot of young people who might want to get into the football industry. So what would be your best advice for someone who has aspiration to work in football?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best advice I could probably give is get experience, any experience, internships, entry-level opportunities. I think just getting in the door at a football club is really important to get that experience. And that'll obviously help inform young people where in the business they want to be. Because I also think step 2 is showing yourself to have a value add for, whoever that is, whether it's ownership groups or CEOs or whatnot. There are so many young people out there who want to get into sport and they all want to do kind of the same thing: social media, marketing. I want to go be a sporting director. And unless you have some sort of differentiating skill set, you kind of just blend in with everyone else. And so what I tell a lot of young people is, look, get into a club, figure out what you want to do, and then figure out what your skill set and how it's differentiated. So maybe it's, you want to be a sporting director and you've gone and worked for a small club in Scandinavia and you've developed your own data algorithm on how to scout players, like something like that would be really useful versus someone who just comes in and says, I just want to work at a football club, because there's a lot of people out there like that. Those are probably the 2 pieces of advice. Obviously, it's a very difficult industry. It's a difficult business, but obviously it's something that's quite rewarding if you can get in.
Yeah, I like that. And I've actually gotten like similar advice before when it comes to like a job interview, to not just say like, I'm a huge fan of this club, or I love sports, I love football. Because as you say, like most people do, that they work in sports, they like it. But what differentiates you from every other applicant? And as you said, if you have something tangible to show, like this is my, you said data model, or this is something else that you can prove how you can add something to that club. I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for instance, if you can generate revenue, like that's any football club in the world is always going to want to hire people that can generate revenue. I realize it's not the sexiest thing in the world. It's not the most fun thing in the world to sell tickets or sponsorships or commercial. But if you can be a really sound, good commercial executive, you will find a job in this business.
Yeah. You get your hands dirty to do internships, to take part. That would be your advice. How important is the academic part of this, the theoretical part?
I mean, I think it's a component. Obviously, you have a lot of MBA programs. I speak at a lot of them, whether it's at business schools or online MBAs. I think that's important. I think it's like any other industry or like the greater business world. A lot of it's more about who you know than what you know. And I think the good thing that I like about internships, we would have an internship program with the Copenhagen School of Business, and that a lot of these students would get 6 months to show us if assuming this is what they wanted, if they were hard workers and had a skill set that they could prove themselves. And I think there's a lot of that in this industry. You really, as a young person, you have to prove yourself. And I think that is something that a lot of people, I think, don't think about. But, the academic stuff is great on a piece of paper, but if you get to a football club and the work ethic isn't there, or for whatever reason, it's not the right fit, that MBA is not going to matter.
That's true. In 2020, you were considered one of the best football executives by World Football Summit. So what are some qualities you think that you have that bring value?
Yeah, I think leadership is certainly one of them. I think one of the things I'm really proud of for us in Denmark, and that was related to that recognition, was the culture we built at the club. There was a lot of difficulties when we got to the club. People didn't want to be there. Players didn't want to be there. Staff. There was infighting and all that kind of stuff. And we had to really clean a lot of that up. And so I think you can certainly bring in executives that can grow revenue and can meet P&L statements and whatnot. But leadership, I think, is something that's really important. And it's not just important for chairman, CEO type roles. It's important for coaches, sporting directors. I think when it comes to sport, there's very much in many organizations that can be difficult, right? Because you have a lot of former players, there's a lot of ego. And I think having proper culture and leadership is something that's really important. And I think that's something that we got recognized for pretty early on in our project.
So how would you describe your leadership style?
Yeah, I think I'm fairly demanding in terms of like what I expect of people that work for me, but I'm also very supportive when it comes to trying to build people up. I think there's a management style that a lot of people, trying to kind of, I don't know what the best way to put it is, but kind of push people down. And for me, I never understood, particularly in sport, when, people who would be working for me, if they do really good work, it would make me look better, right? If I built them up and they did a good job, whether that's my coach or my sporting director or whatnot. And I think a lot of times in sport, there's a lot of ego driven towards, I need to take credit for everything, or I'm the CEO of the club, so I'm literally everything at this club. And I'm kind of have this kind of egocentric view of controlling everything. And I think for me, my leadership style is very much more hands-off, much more taking like kind of a 30,000 foot view of these organizations and trying to support all the people that we brought on and empower them to do better at their job. And ultimately that comes down to hiring the right people, building the right human capital, building the right culture. And obviously if things aren't the right fit, you make changes. But I think that approach has worked well for me, but obviously you need the right people. And I'm really proud of some of the people that we had at our club in Denmark that were able to help execute things for us and make me look better on a day-to-day basis. But I've seen many examples of other clubs where things are not like that. And you can see why they struggle when it comes to both on and off the pitch.
Yeah, definitely. Is there something I haven't asked you yet that you want to mention?
No, I don't think so. It's been very comprehensive.
I'm glad. So the final question that I always ask is, who from your network would be a good guest for this podcast?
Who from my network would be a good guest for this podcast? I have someone, a good friend named Brett Johnson. He was a board member of our club in Denmark, and he's launching a second division club in the USL in the United States and building a new stadium in a mixed-use commercial area. He's also a member of the ownership group at Ipswich Town. And so I think he'd be a really interesting person to talk about all the success they're having at Ipswich right now, which they're on track to potentially get promoted to the Premier League, which would be 2 promotions in 2 seasons. Obviously, his experience with me on the board in Denmark, and then now his experience in Rhode Island with building a club from scratch and opening a new stadium from scratch. So I think he would be a really interesting guest.
Definitely. I'm sold. Jordan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Sports Management Podcast.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @sportmpodcast.